The case felt strangely alive in her hands. The initials seemed to hold warmth through the grime, almost pulsing under her gloved thumb, as if the leather remembered something it wanted her to know. The lock had already failed. The latches hung loose, one bent, as if someone had tried to break in long ago. She lifted, surprised by its weight, far too heavy for an empty suitcase. From inside came a faint metallic rattle that set her heartbeat off rhythm. Too heavy for screws, too heavy for air, she thought. Maybe it wasn't objects inside, maybe it was the weight of a fortune someone meant never to spend. Curiosity overruled reason. She brought the suitcase to the work table beneath the overhead lamp. The cracked leather shone like an animal's hide under light. She unlatched the buckles, the hinges groaned, and layers of yellowed linen appeared, plain, harmless, until she tapped the base. It thudded solid, not hollow. Something hid between the layers. She turned it over. A slight ripple ran where the lining met the frame. Taking her scalpel, she slid the blade gently under the seam. The fabric tore with a dry, reluctant sound. From the cut spilled flakes of paper and a glint of gold dust. She froze. In the beam of the lamp, a sliver of gold shimmered between the layers, heavy stock paper gilded to gleam faintly with age. It whispered that something worth discovering waited below. She didn't open further, just traced the faded initials again. HM. Whoever they were, they'd left something behind that refused to stay buried, and Diana Cole knew instinctively this was no museum cast-off. It was a secret carefully sewn shut, waiting for her hands to unearth it. The room felt smaller the next morning. She came back early, coffee gone cold in her thermos, the city still waking outside the wide basement window. The suitcase sat where she'd left it on the work table, the cut seam waiting like a held breath. She slipped her gloves on again, steady now, and started easing the threads apart. The linen gave way with a sigh. Dust spun into the light. Inside, wedged flat against the metal frame, was an envelope, brittle, yellowed, sealed under wax that had cracked into webbed shards. Her gloved thumb hesitated above it, then lifted it free. The outer paper tore slightly at one corner, revealing cream inside, the faint impression of handwriting pressed so deep it ghosted through. She eased it open. 4 folded certificates slid out, their edges fragile, but the ink remarkably unfaded. Gold Consolidated Mining Company, 1933. She read the heading twice before her mind caught up. Stock certificates. Each bore the embossed signature of a president she didn't recognize. Numbers in the corner, ornate filigree borders, and a single word standing bold in vintage type. Shares, 4,000. Her pulse tightened. Probably replicas, she told herself. They made reproductions like this for museum displays all the time. Someone must have stuffed them into an old suitcase as part of a diorama, then forgotten. Still, the signature and paperweight seemed too exact. She sniffed the fibers, a reflex from years of conservation work. Old paper carried the scent of linen and moisture damage. This had the dryness of genuine bond stock, preserved almost unnaturally well. She took a photo for record, setting her phone on the edge of the table, camera click echoing off concrete. Then she carried the documents down the hallway to the staff lounge, where her colleague Evan was sorting through a donation box of faded posters. He looked up over his glasses, half amused by her expression. What now? Another butterfly case? Look. She set the papers down. He peered closer. Props? That's what I assumed. You're assuming correctly. He picked one up by the corner, examining the gold-printed border. Gold Consolidated went under before the war. Companies printed thousands of these. Some ended up in department store displays. But who keeps replicas sewn into a suitcase lining? He shrugged. Maybe someone liked drama. She smiled slightly, but the question lodged deeper. She leaned against the counter, staring at the initials, HM, burned now into her mind. Evan sipped his coffee, clearly done with the conversation. Don't get lost in it, Di. You know how these annex finds go. 90% junk, 9% mystery, 1% mice. That evening, after the museum closed, she stayed behind. Everyone else left with coats and tired jokes and the sound of heels fading through the marble lobby. She returned to the basement, the suitcase under the lamp again, the certificate spread like delicate leaves beside it. Her laptop hummed faintly as she typed the company's name into the archives portal. Most entries were dead ends: corporate bankruptcies, mergers, forgotten subsidiaries. Then one line caught her breath, a headline from a news database dated only 4 months back. Defunct mining firm reassessed in modern valuation, dormant assets under review. She clicked. The article spilled open with language only economists could love, but she caught the gist. The old Gold Consolidated Company had been absorbed twice and later restructured under a massive resource conglomerate still trading today. Some early issued shares, it said, remained legally valid. Unclaimed securities now worth millions after decades of compounded adjustments. Her hand froze over the trackpad. She scrolled to the end of the article, reading the final sentence 3 times over. Original shareholders may still petition for recognition upon verified authentication of historic certificates. For a long minute, the hum of the old fluorescent lights filled the silence. It was absurd, yet her brain did the math anyway. If any of these papers were genuine, even a single one, the value could surpass anything she'd ever imagined. Not that she'd ever imagined much beyond rent and restoration grants. She looked around, shelves of dusty crates, the leftovers of forgotten trips and exhibits. None held this kind of quiet danger. A soft sound echoed, the faint tick of the heating system winding down. She shivered, not from cold, but from something like awe. The room felt charged, the kind of stillness that follows discovery before the mind names it properly. She carefully rewrapped the certificates, sealing them in an archival sleeve. Her rational side whispered that she'd exaggerating, illusions born from fatigue. But curiosity doesn't obey reason once it's stirred. Back upstairs, the administrative corridor glowed with weak emergency bulbs. She walked past framed photos of past directors, everyone immortalized in clear glass smiles, fingers crossed behind their backs, she suspected. The second floor was empty except for the security guard at the front desk, who nodded as she passed. When she stepped outside, the city air hit her like the slap of possibility: wet pavement, early winter rain, headlights streaking across puddles. Her reflection in the museum's glass doors looked younger, restless. She tightened her coat, clutching the folder against her chest as if warmth might coax an answer out. That night, she couldn't sleep. The certificates haunted the edge of her vision whenever she closed her eyes. She tried to read, but the lines blurred. Around 2, she gave up and turned on her lamp. The city outside her apartment window flickered in stripes of blue and orange. Her laptop glowed beside an empty mug. She opened new tabs, deeper searches: public archives, corporate registries, digitized newspapers. Each link drew her further in. She found mention of a Harold M. Belling, Banker, investor, vanished 1934 after rumored losses tied to gold speculation. The initials matched. The article noted, "Private holdings never recovered." She whispered the letters under her breath. H.M. Belling. It fit too neatly. He could have hidden the papers before disappearing, or after. The thought made her chest tighten. What if the suitcase had been his? She flipped through online ledgers, then paused at a scanned city donation record from 1951. A vague entry listed Misskatern travel effects, source unknown. It corresponded to an acquisition the museum's founder once processed personally. That suede case might have been part of it. 60 years sitting untouched, declared disposable only now by her. Outside, a train moaned somewhere across the bridge. She felt the weight of time collapse inward. The documents in her satchel seemed alive, like they wanted to be more than just found. Curiosity pressed against caution, but curiosity had stronger hands. By dawn, she knew she wouldn't drop it. She would go further, past the rules and polite forgetfulness. If these papers were real, history had slept through a fortune. If they weren't, she'd wasted a few nights. Either way, she couldn't stop now. When the museum reopened that morning, she arrived early, face drawn but steady. The janitor greeted her softly. She barely heard. In her office, she placed the envelope beside the computer, its corners neatly squared, as if presentation might disguise obsession. Then she opened a new search form in the archive's interface, typing Gold Consolidated, Shareholder Records 19340, Private. The screen blinked back with restricted tags. She smiled faintly, more intrigued than discouraged. Every locked door hinted at something worth hearing behind it. Outside her window, the city buses hissed through slush. Inside, her quiet resolve settled into shape. The gold wasn't what drew her anymore, not yet. It was the story. The unseen thread connecting a sealed suitcase in a forgotten basement to a man who vanished before her grandparents were born. Somewhere between those things. Meaning waited. And Diana Cole had decided to find it. By late afternoon, the museum hallways were quiet, the kind of quiet that made every keyboard click sound like confession. Diana stayed buried in the reference stacks, her desk littered with scanned ledgers and a growing family of sticky notes. A half-eaten granola bar sat beside her mouse. The glow from her monitor washed her face in blue as she scrolled through the city archives portal again, fingers trembling slightly from too much coffee. She'd already located the company's founding documents and its bankruptcy filings. Most names were meaningless, clerks, auditors, secretaries long gone. But on one image, a list of verified deed holders, a name jumped at her. Henry M. Belling. Not Harold, Henry. She leaned back slowly, heart thudding. Same initials as on the suitcase. The city registry listed him as a banker who vanished mid-decade, presumed dead after a market crash. His estate had been tied up in litigation for years, then quietly closed. Her cursor hovered over a linked record marked Restricted Donation, Museum Property number 472A. She tried the password section of her credential card. Permission denied. A polite system box blinked back. Special access required. She frowned. The entry date lined up almost perfectly with the old acquisition ledger she'd glimpsed at home. She stood, stretched, and walked to the storage office. The lights flickered once as the motion sensors caught her shadow. On the far shelf rested the archive compendium, thick gray binders where paper backups outlasted the digital transitions. She slid out the volume corresponding to 195 1953 and flipped until a faint smell of mildew met her nose. There, between entries of costume donations and architectural fragments, was the notation Travel Effects, Donor H.M. Belling, unverified. Received boxed unlisted contents, pending claim. Signed in the slanted script of the museum's founder, Martha Leduc. Belling. It wasn't coincidence now. The suitcase carried his ghost like a business card. She photographed the page, carefully, adjusting the focus until the pen ink gleamed under lamplight. Her intuition buzzed so loud she almost didn't notice the hush of the hallway until a voice startled her from the doorway. Still at it? Evan leaned against the frame with a half grin. They're going to start billing you rent for this room. She forced a smile. Just finishing catalog updates. He raised an eyebrow. You look like you haven't blinked in an hour. She closed the binder. Found something odd in the donation logs. An old banker, maybe tied to that suitcase. The dead usually are. His tone was dry, but not cruel. Don't go turning it into a ghost story. It's not that, she murmured, but he'd already wandered off toward the elevators. When the doors shut, she exhaled slowly. Alone again. The air felt denser now, like the walls themselves wanted to keep her company. By evening, she had set up camp in the reading room. The fluorescent hum echoed through shelves of microfilm reels, each labeled in hand-drawn dates. She fed one into the viewer and watched headlines blur past like ghosts of type. Banker disappears amidst gold crash. Speculators flee city. Wife claims husband, hiding assets abroad. And then, smaller text beneath. Several personal holdings, including company share certificates unaccounted for, authorities suspect transfer to anonymous trust. No follow-up article existed. It simply ended there, swallowed by time. She rubbed her eyes, then noticed another document in the reel, a municipal estate summary from 1936. In handwritten margin beside the line for Henry M. Belling was a note. Her pulse steadied to read it. Hold until the city falls quiet. The words swayed faintly in the projector's flicker, like someone whispering from the past. She copied it down. The phrase made no clerical sense. Hold what? And what did falls quiet mean? Economic recovery. Wartime silence. Burial? Her phone buzzed on the table. A message from the collections group chat. Tonight's reception photos uploaded. Don't forget tomorrow's clean-out schedule. Daily life intruding again, trying to drag her back to the mundane surface. She ignored it. She switched off the projector and sat in the dark for a moment. Only the exit light glowed red across the floor. She pictured Belling writing that note in a margin, deciding to vanish while the market crumbled. Maybe he'd hidden his shares not out of greed, but desperation to protect them from seizure. The suitcase might have been a vault disguised as travel baggage. Her mind spiraled until she realized her throat had gone dry. She packed up her notes, but before heading for the exit, she glanced one more time at the suitcase stored under her desk. Its leather looked darker now, almost wet in the low light, like it remembered rain. The next morning, she went digging for primary films in the off-limit zone. Archive Room D, where staff clearance required a key she technically shouldn't have, but the door's top latch always misaligned. One nudge with the edge of her ID card, and it clicked open. Dust motes swirled in a thin beam from the transom window. Shelves of unindexed folders stood like rows of tombstones. She found the section labeled Belling Depositories, 4 folders stapled with brittle metal prongs, edges singed from decades of neglect. The top record confirmed Belling's client list, mostly banks. The last sheet carried an annotation in different handwriting. Transferred holdings to experiential trust under cultural oversight. See Monsieur Leduc. Leduc again, the founder. She flipped the page to find a partial address. At the bottom, scrawled faintly, the same margin phrase appeared again. Hold until the city falls quiet. Twice, identical hand, coincidence transformed into pattern. A chill pulled up her arms. Her conscience pricked. She was deep in records labeled confidential. But she couldn't stop now. She copied the phrase, the address, everything into her notebook, slid the folder back, and closed the door quietly behind her. All day, her mind replayed the discovery. She could barely track her own scheduled tours. Visitors asked questions she answered without hearing them. When evening fell, she returned to her apartment and spread papers across her kitchen table until it resembled a map of obsession. Timeline: 1933, stock issued. 1934, crash. 1936, disappearance. 1951, donation logged. Current value, unknown, possibly immense. Thread stitching all pieces, Belling, Leduc, and a suitcase that found its way to her hands 70 years later. But there was one more line of investigation. She searched the museum's internal staff directory for employees who'd worked under Leduc's administration. Only 2 living ex-staffers remained, now retired into near legend. She dialed the first number she found, a disconnected line in an old house listing. The second, listed as Charles Rayner, archivist, retired, still had an active number. She left a voicemail explaining she wanted to verify an old accession. Within an hour, he called back. "Miss Cole, you're digging where few do," a gravelly voice said. "I'm reviewing a suitcase donation linked to early archives," she replied carefully. Silence hummed. Then, "Bellings?" Her breath caught. "You know the name?" Every intern whispered at once. The ghost donor. Never officially acknowledged, but everyone knew something valuable passed through. Miss Leduc handled it herself. Files went missing after she died. Missing? Reclassified is what the memo said. He chuckled dryly. Same thing. She thanked him and promised to keep confidentiality. When the line went dead, she stared at her notes until words blurred. The retired archivist's casual tone couldn't hide the weight in what he'd said. Something valuable had indeed passed through. And someone, maybe Leduc herself, decided to hide it from official record. She walked to the window. Across the street, the city lights flickered in drizzle, reflections shimmering like coins scattered over asphalt. She pressed her forehead against the glass, whispering the phrase again. Hold until the city falls quiet. Was the city quiet now? Or had it only just begun to speak again through her? Underneath those thoughts, a new unease stirred. The sense that she'd crossed a border somewhere invisible. Files vanished from the portal the next time she checked, replaced by access pending review. Someone else inside the institution might have noticed her search trail. She felt suddenly watched, faintly trespassing in her own field. Yet the allure only deepened. Whatever had been hidden in that suitcase's lining wasn't simply money. It was intent, a moral puzzle disguised in gold leaf and dust. She turned back to her table, spotlighting the photographs, her handwriting looping between them like electrical current. The case had waited generations for hands willing to reopen it. She rested her palms flat against the papers as if to steady an invisible tremor. The air in her apartment thinned to the weightless pause between questions and answers. Then she reached for the phone again, not to call the museum, not even Evan, but to jot a reminder on her screen. Verify authenticity of stock certificates. Physical appraisal required. The note winked cold light against her tired face. She shut the laptop and whispered softly, "All right then, let's find out what you're really worth." Outside, traffic hissed past like wind through vault doors. The story, once confined to paper and myth, was moving, alive. By the time she turned off the lights, the suitcase gleamed faintly under the lamplight, its seams holding secrets that no longer wanted to stay sewn. And Diana Cole, guardian of forgotten things, had decided to listen to their call. The week spun quietly around her, full of small talk and thin air. Each task felt mechanical until the name Belling echoed again in her file notes. That morning, Diana finally gave in to impulse. She wrapped the certificates in acid-free tissue, slid them into an archival folder, and added a layer of plain cardboard on top. Professional concealment. When the courier van arrived for exhibit loans, she tucked her package in too, labeling it Private Appraisal, Historic Display Mock-ups. She told herself it wasn't deceit, just prudence. The appraiser would never suspect she was testing the impossible. His office occupied the upper floor of a century-old warehouse overlooking the harbor. Inside, everything smelled of varnish and seawater. Shelves gleamed with glass cases, each holding coins, medals, and sheets of paper worth more than any car she'd ever owned. The man himself, Alden, looked built from the same material as his trade, polished, deliberate, eyes the color of nickel. "So, you've brought something interesting," he said, adjusting his spectacles as she unwrapped the folder. "Possible historic replicas," she replied, aiming for casual. "They surfaced from storage. I'd like to confirm their type for a temporary display." He nodded, spreading the certificates across black velvet. His fingers didn't shake, but his breath caught slightly at the first glint of guilt. 1933 issue? Yes, gold consolidated mining. He lifted one to the light, tracing the embossed seal. A faint hiss escaped between his teeth. "You said replicas?" "That's the assumption," she answered. He didn't respond right away. Instead, he fetched a jeweler's loupe, examining every inch of paper, fiber, watermark, and signature. Minutes stretched until the sound of gulls outside felt like an alarm clock she couldn't shut off. Finally, he set the certificate down very softly, as one might a piece of evidence in court. "These are not replicas," he said, "and if they are, the counterfeiter deserves a Nobel Prize." Something in his tone made her mouth dry. "You're certain?" Authenticity markers align perfectly with the final pre-reform print run, the gold leaf, ink saturation, even the microfiligree pattern along the border. These were meant for circulation before the crash halted distribution. She forced a slow breath. "Then what's their value?" He hesitated, calculating. "You said from storage, museum property?" "An unlisted donation, long forgotten." Alden frowned, avoiding her eyes. "If untouched by legal claim, each certificate represents roughly 3,000 shares. The company's successor firm announced revaluation this quarter. Gold extraction rights validated, assets secure. Adjusted market value, adjusted dividends." His words slowed, heavy as lead. "We're talking well above 12 million. Her brain buffered silence. Outside, a foghorn groaned somewhere over the bay as if answering on fate's behalf. 12 million. The number glowed behind her eyelids, impossible but specific. She tried to laugh, came out brittle. "Surely that can't—" He raised a hand. "Before you celebrate, verify through second appraisal." Numbers like that attract attention you may not want. By the time she left his office, the sun had bled into the skyline. Her reflection in the glass elevator looked foreign, paler, older, holding something too heavy for hands. On the street, rain had started. She pressed the folder closer beneath her coat. Back home, she sat motionless at her kitchen table while water drummed the window. Appraisal, verification, value, words that belonged to finance, not history. She was trained to preserve relics, not profit from them. Yet all night, the figure floated through her mind like a haunting melody. 12 million. At midnight, her phone rang. Unknown number, no caller ID. She hesitated, then answered. Static, crackled, followed by a calm, unfamiliar voice. Miss Cole? Yes. Some claims are better left buried. Click. Deadline. Her body locked, heartbeat in her ears. She replayed the call again and again, convincing herself it was a prank. But how would anyone outside know her involvement? Had Alden mentioned her name? Had the institution noticed her unauthorized appraisal? Fear built in layers, one thought stacking over the next, until exhaustion became its own mercy. Next morning, she brought the documents back to the museum, pretending calm. She slipped them into her office drawer, key turned tight. Around her, normalcy paraded through. School tours, emails, budget meetings. Yet every conversation sounded distant, muffled beneath the hum of secrecy. At lunch, she overheard Evan chatting near the break room. Strange activity at the storage annex last night, he said to another curator. Security alarm tripped for no reason. Door left ajar, but nothing stolen. Her fork froze midair. Annex alarm, her annex. She forced an easy smile when they noticed her, but inside panic constricted like wire. After work, she returned to check. The elevator's old gate screeched open. The basement smelled faintly of ozone from the security light. The suitcase stood under its plastic cover exactly where she'd left it. But the nearby dust told another story. Footprints, faint but fresh, leading from the service stairs to her work table. They vanished beneath the rolling carts. She knelt, scanning the floor. One scrap of linen thread, snipped clean, lay by her heel. Whoever had come here knew what they were looking for. That night, she locked the certificates inside a small safe her landlord had once installed for tenants. Cheap steel, but better than nothing. The weight of the key felt absurdly small for what it guarded. Sleep refused again. Instead, she wandered her apartment, lights off, city glow pooling against her curtains. Thoughts swung between temptation and duty. 12 million could rebuild the museum's decaying wings, fund every exhibit she'd ever dreamed of. Yet one part of her whispered the old founder's creed she'd read years earlier. Preservation over possession. She recited it like a prayer, hoping it would dull the edge of greed clawing at her ribs. By dawn, she'd drafted 2 plans. One for turning the find over to the museum board through proper channels, another for anonymously liquidating it and funneling proceeds into cultural grants. Both seemed impossible. Both felt like betrayal depending on where she aimed her conscience. Every shadow that moved beyond her window made her flinch. Every unknown number on her phone felt like the voice returning to warn her again. She considered calling Evan or even Alden, but decided silence was safer. Secrets kept in motion were still alive. Spoken aloud, they became targets. The following afternoon, she forced herself to finish scheduled work, labeling a shipment of ceramic fragments from an overseas dig. Precision steadied her hands until she noticed her reflection in the box's glossy surface. wide-eyed, sleepless, yet beginning to look like someone guarding treasure rather than truth. Guilt followed the recognition like a scent she couldn't wash off. When the security team filed their nightly report, she requested to review the footage from the annex alarm. The guard shrugged, saying the feed malfunctioned. Blank spacing, static wash between frames. A coincidence, but it landed in her stomach as certainty of watchful eyes. In the next week, her isolation deepened. Friends texted. She ignored them. Even Evan's banter grated like interrogation. Her world shrank to paper and suspicion. At times, she caught herself whispering to the suitcase, absurdly gentle, as though it might answer. "What did you want me to find?" Still, beneath the fatigue and fear, a strange composure formed. The calm of someone standing inside history's unfinished chapter. Verification had given birth to doubt, but also to purpose. Late one Friday, she returned to the storage floor once more. The air carried the cold clarity before snowfall. She unlocked the door, stepped inside, and felt the stillness settle over her. She touched the suitcase handle. It was colder than the rest of the room, as if metal remembered the hands before hers. "Hold until the city falls quiet," she whispered. The phrase sounded different now, less instruction, more invitation. When she turned off the light, her reflection lingered in the glass pane. A curator wrapped in shadow, holding value that could rewrite a museum's future or end her career. The alarm light blinked once as the door clicked behind her, steady like a heart monitor for the past. The next morning, sunlight angled through the museum's glass atrium like a searchlight over stone. Diana moved through the corridors before visitors arrived, her heels soft against marble. She carried a stack of accession ledgers under her arm, pretending her pace was routine. But her pulse argued otherwise. In her office, she cleared a space on her desk and opened the oldest ledger from the stack, a broad, faded book that smelled faintly of glue and mildew. The handwriting inside belonged to Martha Leduc, the museum's founder. Ink flourishes, careful margins, every entry a ritual of control. Diana skimmed until the year 1951, her eyes narrowing on a page labeled Unverified Acquisitions. The line was dull except for one annotation in pencil. Travel effects, potential historical value. Donor, Belling, H.M. She traced the words slowly, feeling a tremor in her chest. The signature below wasn't the usual administrative scrawl. It was Leduc's personal sign-off, written in thick, assertive strokes. So the founder herself had decided to take Belling's belongings. She hadn't logged a provenance report, hadn't filed an ownership claim, just took the suitcase as museum, property under special discretion. Diana flipped the next page, half hoping to find a justification. Instead, she found a loose memo folded inside. Typed, brittle, and water-stained, it read, "Preserve the evidence of value. Do not inquire beyond purpose." The words rushed heat through her spine. It was a creed disguised as bureaucratic warning. Preserve, but don't pursue. Maybe Leduc had found out what the suitcase contained and decided secrecy was safer than legality. A knock at her door made her jump. Evan leaned in with a mug. "You've barely looked human this week. Coffee?" "Thanks," she said, startled by the normal tone. He stepped closer, noticing the ledger. "Antique reading?" "Archival cleanup. Leduc's old notes." He tilted his head. "You're chasing that suitcase again." Her silence confirmed it. He sighed. "I did some digging on my own. You were right about the initials." He set down his mug, pulled a folded paper from his pocket. "Henry M. Belling, banker, investor, vanished mid-crash, but Get this. He used to sit on the board that funded this museum's construction. There's your link. Diana blinked. You're serious? Buried in an old city financial directory, Belling and Leduc must have known each other. The fact rearranged everything. Belling hadn't randomly donated the suitcase. It was deliberate, a transaction between partners in preservation. Evan continued, voice low. Rumor says the early financing was messy. Some investors pulled out, others lost their shirts when the Depression hit. Leduc rescued the foundation by reallocating private assets. That's the polite term. He leaned on the desk. If those shares were part of it, then this institution owes its survival to quiet theft. Or to protection, Diana said softly. He looked at her, puzzled. She pointed to the memo. Maybe Belling asked her to hide them. His note said, hold until the city falls quiet. Maybe he meant until the chaos passed, until history stabilized. Evan exhaled, backing away. You really believe that? I don't know what I believe, but I can feel the logic in it. When he left, she stared at the ledger again. Beneath all the handwriting, all the official certainty, the paper still hummed with things unsaid. She turned to the back cover and noticed a flap of old binding loose along the edge. Underneath it, pressed flat like a pressed flower, lay a folded page in Leduc's handwriting. Ink faded but legible. We protect what cannot protect itself, even if it means hiding truth from its owners. Her throat tightened. Preservation over possession. Leduc had lived by it. The suitcase wasn't just a container for stock. It was a symbol of the founder's vow. That evening, Diana went down to the basement again. Light sliced across the room from the high windows, scattering dust like confetti. She crouched near the suitcase, tracing the seams she'd once cut open. The brass locks had dulled to the color of dried honey. She whispered, "What did you two promise each other?" The annex's silence answered with its usual hum. But when she lifted the case and set it on the rolling cart, she felt uneven weight near the base, denser than before. She tugged at the false lining she'd previously ignored. It shifted slightly. She fetched her scalpel, working carefully along the remaining stitches. A section of lining came free with a sigh and exposed a hidden compartment no larger than her hand. Inside, a yellowed envelope lay crushed flat. She hesitated, that old pulse of awe and guilt returning. The flap tore as she eased it open. Out slid a single folded sheet and a pressed black ribbon. Her eyes caught the faint script. For the holding institution, final instruction. The letter began with crown pencil handwriting, surely Belling's own. If this case survives, my fear has also escaped me. The shares remain a burden I could not bear on open ledgers. Miss Leduc will understand their purpose. Wealth, when visible, is seized. When hidden, it preserves. Hold these until the city finds humility again. Should they surface later, may their value restore rather than consume. She stopped reading aloud, realizing her lips had been moving, shaping the eerie intimacy of a voice 70 years gone. Beneath the prose lay another line in different ink, likely Leduc's. His wish honored, hidden until trust returns. Diana pressed the page flat, the air suddenly heavy with realization. Belling had chosen the museum as a vault of conscience. Leduc had guarded that moral inheritance in silence, and somehow, across decades, the burden had slid into her hands. The realization simmered all night. She didn't eat, didn't scroll news, simply sat at her desk tracing the loops of both signatures. There was sadness in their pen strokes, like each understood that moral preservation always carried loss. By morning, she called Charles Rayner again, the retired archivist. His voice crackled through the line. "You were right," she said quietly. "Leduc and Belling worked together." He chuckled. "We all suspected. You've found proof then." "Letters, instructions. She hid them inside the suitcase." "Of course she did. Martha never trusted filing cabinets." There was a warmth under his baritone that steadied her. "Why the secrecy?" she asked. "Because," he said, "the founding fund came from men who thought value only existed in numbers. Martha and Belling believed preservation was a better ledger. They didn't want profit. They wanted continuity." "Continuity," she repeated. "She once told me, money disappears, meaning doesn't. If one must hide the first to save the second, so be it." Sounds like Leduc, doesn't it? Diana felt tears sting without permission. It does. When they hung up, she walked the quiet corridors before visitors entered. Portraits of donors watched from gilded frames, their painted eyes judging and pleading all at once. Every exhibit label, every artifact under glass, carried the faint ghost of someone who had given without being remembered. The suitcase had turned her into one of them, a keeper caught between truth and silence. She returned to her office and drafted notes: potential report, inferred provenance, historical chain linking Belling and Leduc. But her hand stopped midway through. Reporting would expose the hidden fortune. Every legal department in the city would descend, stripping the story to numbers. Belling's intention, his warning about visible wealth, would die on contact. She leaned back, staring at the window. Outside, winter light smudged the skyline gold. Reflection trembled across her desk, glinting off the cracked suitcase handle like a wink from both ghosts. Maybe guarding this secret wasn't betrayal. It was fulfillment. She slid the letter back into its envelope, wrapped the suitcase in archival cloth, and labeled the tag in neat handwriting: Estate Artifact Confidential Custody, Provisional Preservation. A phrase that meant nothing and everything at once. Before leaving, she whispered, "I'll keep it safe." In the hallway, she heard faint laughter from a school group arriving early, children running past exhibitions of ancient coins and sculptures, their sneakers squeaking across marble. For a moment, she imagined Belling watching from somewhere just beyond the years, nodding at the sound of life his hidden gold might one day sustain. By the time she reached the entrance, her doubt had evolved into resolve. The legacy wasn't the money. It was the principle of trust, the belief that some values were meant to sleep until the right hands woke them. At her desk again, she opened a new file on her computer. Title: Preservation Trust Proposal. Purpose: redirect unclaimed historic assets toward cultural restoration. She didn't know how to make it legal yet, but she knew this was where the story pointed. Leduc's creed had found a new keeper. As evening pooled violet through the windows, she shut down her monitor and turned off the lamp. Behind her, the suitcase sat under its cloth, perfectly ordinary again. Only the tag glimmered faintly in the dying light, a quiet promise between generations of custodians, each keeping history from devouring itself. Diana locked the office door, her footsteps echoing softly like a vow returned. She stayed long after closing, the museum empty but alive with the echo of her shoes across marble. The suitcase waited under a single desk lamp in the basement office, dull brown in the half-dark, like a creature that had retreated into hiding and was ready to breathe again. Diana set her keys aside, pulled up a chair, and unwrapped the preserved bundle she'd rehidden only nights ago. The envelope torn from the false bottom lay where she'd left it. Fragile paper, browned, edges, and that smell, ink, dust, and something faintly metallic, as if gold had a scent all its own. Her hands shook when she opened it. The letter inside was written with a fountain pen that had scratched hard against the page, each loop deliberate. The ink had turned from black to rust-colored, but still elegant enough to carry its weight. Across the top, in careful script, to the future keeper of value. She read aloud softly, voice catching on the old rhythm of another century. When speculation devoured my home, I learned what gold truly destroys. I have hidden here what cannot be trusted to men still hungry. Preserve these shares not as currency, but as witness. Should they find daylight in gentler times, may they restore the things greed has broken. Her breath left her in a controlled exhale. It continued for several pages, Belling recounting his ruin during the crash, the collapse of his bank, the shame of friends turned predators. He wrote of his partnership with Martha Leduc, praising her conviction that museums existed to shelter the world's forgotten meanings, not its possessions. In one paragraph, his confession bent toward prayer. Gold kept too long turns to guilt. If ever released, let it feed culture, not consumption. Diana's throat tightened. She imagined him writing by lamplight, the faint tremor of panic under his pen as the markets collapsed outside his window. He'd chosen the museum not as storage, but as sanctuary, an ark for paper that the world would otherwise burn for its numbers. At the end of the letter, his signature curved beneath a simple postscript. Leave this with her. She will know what to do. Below that, another ink entirely, darker, steadier, added later by Martha Leduc herself. I have read his plea. The fortune will sleep until worth returns to meaning. Diana folded the letter closed and pressed the creases with her palm. Her desk clock ticked once too loudly. She realized she was crying before she noticed the tears falling. It wasn't grief exactly, it was recognition. Across decades, she could feel both of them, the vanished banker and the steadfast founder, reaching forward through the dust, trusting a stranger to understand. She sat back, letting her thoughts scatter through the lamplight. The room looked different now. Every shelf of artifacts shimmering with quiet intent, every label an apology for what money once stole. History had always been a form of promise, she thought. But this was a contract, not of ownership, but stewardship. For a long while, she simply listened, the faint hum of the dehumidifier, the shuffle of distant pipes. When she looked again at the letter, one line drew her like gravity. Preserve these shares not as currency, but as witness. The phrase circled in her mind until it became instruction. She would not sell them. She would not report them for claim. She would turn them into something that endured. Her practical mind bristled at the impossibility. Legally, the certificates belonged to some half-forgotten corporate web. But if their value existed at all, she could bend it toward what it was meant for. Cultural preservation, she whispered. The words filled the cold space like breath. She imagined the reaction of the museum's board if they discovered what she had found, a fortune buried under their feet while budgets starved. They'd see numbers, not meaning. They'd auction, litigate, divide. In a week, the story would vanish into paperwork, and Belling's intention would die again. She felt her pulse thump against her collarbone. No, secrecy was the only honesty left. She gathered herself and began to draft notes on a yellow pad, small bullet points forming the backbone of something larger. Step 1, establish independent trust. Step 2, Identify restoration projects needing immediate funding. Step 3. Disperse quietly under donor anonymity. Each item steadied her shaking hands. Meaning could be protected through action, not declaration. A soft sound interrupted her thoughts. Just the settling of the pipes, she told herself, but it felt like approval. She smiled faintly at the absurdity. "All right, Henry," she said under her breath, "we'll do it your way." Hours slipped unnoticed. When she finally rose, dawn tinted the basement windows faint peach. She placed the letter back into its envelope, wrapped it in acid-free paper, and laid it gently atop the suitcase's contents. Instead of locking it away, she left the case open under the cloth, half revealed, half veiled, like unfinished work in a studio. Something about that felt right. Upstairs, the early custodial staff moved through the halls with quiet mops and coffee cups. Diana walked among them feeling both lighter and older. The city outside glowed wet from night rain. She paused near a window where sunlight struck the museum's bronze dedication plaque. For the first time, she noticed how the metal shimmered almost gold. Back in her office, she opened her laptop and typed the first line of a new document. Proposal for Cultural Heritage Trust, in memory of unnamed benefactors. She outlined grants for underfunded conservation projects, scholarships for archival studies, emergency restoration funds, all under the pretense of a quiet donation soon to be announced. She would need help to navigate the legal corridors, but that could wait. The first step was belief. At noon, Evan stopped by with his usual sardonic nod. "You look different," he said, "like you've slept for a century." "Maybe I finally did," she answered. She didn't mention the letter. She only smiled and offered him the leftover coffee he'd given her days before. When he left, she reread Belling's handwriting once more, committing the lines to memory. Wealth, when visible, is seized. When hidden, it preserves. It felt older than a motto. It felt like a warning written for every curator who mistook cataloging for safety. She closed her eyes and pictured his last scene. The banker sealing the suitcase, pressing wax, sliding stock papers inside, while sirens of collapsing banks wailed beyond the window. Then the image shifted to Martha Leduc, hiding it among museum freight, her heartbeat steady as she wrote "confidential custody" on a shipping label. And finally, herself, decades later, unfolding their trust note in the glare of fluorescent light. 3 keepers of one value, passing the secret along the slow current of time. When evening returned, she descended once more to the basement. The air was cool, still tinged with the scent of preserved leather. The suitcase gleamed faintly under the lamp. She touched the handle, each ridge mapped by other palms before hers, and whispered, "Thank you." Something in that silence felt responsive. Perhaps imagination, perhaps history breathing through its chosen conduit. Either way, it left her steady. She turned off the light. In the half-dark, the suitcase's outline looked less like luggage and more like a reliquary, crude but sacred, an object meant to remind rather than reveal. The glow from the hallway caught its brass corners, turning them momentarily gold. As she closed the door, she felt in her chest the strange peace of someone who has inherited purpose instead of wealth. The world above would continue chasing numbers. Down here, meaning slept safe inside old leather. Diana exhaled, pocketed the key, and whispered into the dim corridor, one promise meant for ghosts and future curators alike. "Your fortune will hold. I'll see to that." The summons arrived by email first. a polite notice from the museum's legal department requesting a clarification of accession records and ownership status for the recently cataloged suitcase. Then came a phone call from a city finance official. Her voice was careful, professional, and far too curious. Someone had flagged the archival tag mentioning estate artifact provisional preservation. They wanted documentation by week's end. Diana listened, heart throttled between beats. Of course, she said, and scheduled a meeting she had no intention of keeping without preparation. When the call ended, she lowered the phone and stared at the museum's founder's portrait on the opposite wall. Martha Leduc smiled faintly in oil paint, gaze sharp enough to approve or condemn. That night, she spread her files across the kitchen table again, each sheet glowing under lamplight like a separate confession. There was no clear road left. Hand the discovery to the board and watch the trust dissolve in bureaucracy, or conceal it until she could fulfill Belling's request properly. Both choices felt treacherous. 2 days later, she met with a retired archivist, Charles Rayner, in a quiet cafe near the harbor. She'd chosen the seat facing the window so that the water outside could remind her of distance. He was older now, beard white and voice more gravel than air, but he smiled as though he'd been expecting her all along. I wondered how long before someone opened that case, he said, stirring his coffee. You knew about it? Only whispers. Leduc kept its real contents sealed off even from senior staff. When I inherited the keys to Archive Room D, I found an empty file labeled Belling. Knew better than to ask. She hesitated. The stock is valid again, its value astronomical. Yes. His brow lifted slightly. And now the lawyers want it, yes? They've already called. Rayner folded his hands. Then it's begun. You have a choice, Miss Cole. Play by their definitions and lose the meaning, or define value on your own terms. She watched steam rise from her cup, curling like script without language. If I hide it, I risk my job, maybe more. And if you reveal it, you erase the reason it was hidden. Their silence filled the space between caution and faith. Outside, a seabird glided low across rippling water, banking sharply before vanishing into fog. He leaned closer. There's a middle ground. I can teach you how to open a trust quietly, one existing under dormant preservation accounts. No names, just an institutional shell. The museum believes those ledgers dead, they survive in the archives. We could place the reissued value there, under stewardship, not ownership. You'd help me? I'm old enough not to care about job titles. He smiled. Martha and I used to dream about redemption funds, money that undoes the damage of greed. Suppose we finally make one real. Hope and terror share the same heartbeat. She nodded slowly, words caught in her throat. Then we do it for them. For the next week, Diana balanced two lives, daylight curator performing mundane duties, and twilight strategist shaping invisible accounts. She and Rayner met after hours in the bowels of the records department, where old safes lined the wall like sleeping giants. From one drawer, he produced a typed form dated 1952, Continuing Cultural Endowment, Section 9B, dormant since charter expiration. He pointed. Insert modern valuation here, attached to anonymous donor code. She copied the figures with the trembling pen. As she wrote, the number 12 million looked indecent in ink. Yet instead of greed, she felt strange calm. It no longer symbolized wealth, it measured possibility. They wired preliminary documents through secure intermediaries, each step a whispered rebellion. If traced, both could lose everything. But Rayner's humor kept fear at bay. I doubt the spirits of our founders want to see headlines, he joked. At dawn on the fourth day, the deed was effectively complete. A heritage preservation grant, untied to any individual, existed again. It possessed startup capital equal to the assessed stock value. Beneficiary, public cultural restoration programs nationwide. Trustee, the museum's unclaimed legacy account. The fortune Belling hid was no longer private. It was resurrected meaning. Still, danger lingered. The legal department's reminders grew sharper, citing potential civil forfeiture of recovered securities. One even arrived by courier, embossed seal bright against government gray. She signed nothing. When Friday came, she faced the boardroom filled with officials, lawyers, and department heads, all polite masks of control. They asked about documentation. She explained with practiced calm that earlier unverified shares had been securely registered to the museum's endowment in accordance with donor intent. Technical language, precise enough to sound bureaucratically dull. None pressed further. The phrase endowment compliance lulled them into satisfaction. Afterward, her legs nearly failed in the hallway. She leaned against the cool marble, half laughing, half shaking. Evan appeared with a folder under his arm. "You okay?" "Fine," she murmured. "You're trembling." Relief. He studied her. "They say mystery makes curators live longer. Maybe you'll last forever." She smiled thinly. "I'm just trying to keep history alive." Later that evening, the museum announced a new funding initiative. No donor named, only acknowledgement of historic assets reactivated in public trust. Within hours, emails poured from media outlets speculating about a wealthy benefactor or lucky discovery. Diana read none of them. Instead, she walked down to the annex, where the air still smelled of paper and secrecy. The suitcase sat under its cloth, unremarkable again. She removed the cover, ran her fingertips along the leather, and whispered, "It's done." A power flicker dimmed the bulbs to amber. For a heartbeat, she saw her reflection merge with the case. A blurred silhouette that might have been Leduc's or Belling's or her own folded through time. Outside, news crews filmed the museum facade, narrating about generosity and revival. Inside, within the quiet basement, Diana smiled with tired peace. The grant had already begun processing through Rayner's network. Restorers across the region would soon receive anonymous funding. Paint peeled from frescoes would be repaired. Archives that nearly closed would open their doors again. The following week, the finance inquiry ceased entirely. Official paperwork arrived stating the matter of disputed ownership, resolved under institutional heritage reconciliation. Bureaucratic poetry for closed mysteries. She kept one certificate sealed in her office safe, not out of greed, but remembrance. Its embossed edges caught dawn light each morning when she arrived early, proof that meaning could hide in plain sight. Months passed. The museum hummed with new energy, fresh staffing, revitalized exhibits, even whispers of expansion grants none truly understood. Staff speculated about the unknown donor, and legend blossomed overnight. Evan cornered her one afternoon near the atrium. "You sure you're not behind this miracle money?" She shrugged. "I restore artifacts, not fortunes." He grinned. "That's precisely why I think you are." She laughed softly and walked away before he could read truth behind her smile. That night, alone once more in the basement, Diana opened her notebook. At the top, she wrote a single line quoting both ghosts who had guided her. "We protect what cannot protect itself." Then beneath it, "Objective complete." Above, rain threaded down the storm glass window, filling the silence in slow, steady rhythm. She set her pen beside the paper, folded her hands, and listened as thunder rolled faintly across the city, the kind of sound Martha LeDuc might have called the city falling quiet. For the first time since lifting the suitcase, Diana felt truly still. Not triumphant, not afraid, simply woven into the long fabric of keepers who chose meaning over possession. In the corner, the suitcase gleamed faintly in lamplight, gold tint flickering across its handle like a promise kept. The museum's courtyard filled with sound again, hammering from new display stands, chatter from volunteers, the easy chaos of renewal. Months had passed since the suitcase had been sealed one last time, and the building itself seemed changed by what its walls now carried. Donations poured in, small and large, feeding projects that had long sat waiting for miracle budgets. A new textile wing opened that spring. The press hailed it as the result of unprecedented private generosity. No one could name the source, but gratitude spread like sunlight along the marble balconies. Diana watched the story unfold from the background. She kept to quiet tasks, approving exhibit lighting, preparing catalogs, guiding interns. They speculated endlessly. Some convinced a billionaire had chosen the museum as a pet project. Others claiming an international recovery fund had stepped in. None mentioned her, or the forgotten case beneath the archive shelves. That was exactly as she wanted it. One morning, as she walked the central gallery, she overheard two visitors admiring the bronze dedication plaque newly polished above the entrance. "Imagine," one said, $12 million just given away. Whoever did that must really love this place." Diana smiled and moved on, her shoes whispering over terrazzo floors. Love was close to the truth, but not hers alone. The fortune had belonged to a line of love stretching back through LeDuc's pen strokes and Belling's trembling hands. Love for the fragile persistence of memory itself. Across the main stair hung a new banner. Preservation Trust Initiative, investing in the past to protect the future. Each word carried weight she could almost feel pressing through her ribs. Departments once on budgetary life support now hosted lectures and residencies. Students filled rooms that had been silent for decades. For the first time in years, she heard laughter echo inside archives that used to smell only of paper and anxiety. When journalists asked for comment, the director spoke carefully. "We cannot disclose our benefactor's identity, but the gesture represents faith in heritage. It reminds us that history sometimes rewards those who wait." The phrase became a headline before sunset. At night, when the museum emptied, Diana often slipped downstairs to the annex just to stand near the suitcase. It had been cleaned, stabilized, and placed in a modest display case near the restoration lab, an internal exhibit only staff could visit. A small brushed metal plaque read, "Donated by an unknown benefactor, circa mid-20th century." Visitors occasionally mistook it for a prop, nothing more, but those who paused often noted the careful restoration around the seams and the slight glint along one corner, as though dust couldn't quite decide whether to settle. To Diana, that faint sheen was the heartbeat of the story, proof that secrecy and generosity could share the same breath. Evan visited her there sometimes. "So this is the legend's cradle," he'd say with mock solemnity, tapping the glass. "Think it still hides more treasure?" "Only patience," she'd answer. He laughed, though his eyes lingered longer than joking required. "I'll never figure out what really happened, will I?" She met his gaze gently. Maybe you're not meant to. Some histories live better as questions. Outside, spring rain patterned the skylight. The museum lights dimmed in closing sequence, each corridor fading like a held note. In that hush, she felt the same quiet pulse that had guided her since opening the case, a thread connecting every keeper before her, binding them to purpose. The legend grew beyond their walls. Local papers dubbed the anonymous contributor the ghost donor. Rumors claimed secret societies, lost inheritances, even royal ties. None mattered. The real story moved through quieter channels, grants signed, restorers paid, scholars funded. The fortune was already dissolving back into meaning, exactly as Belling had hoped. On the first anniversary of the museum's rebirth, the board hosted a gala in the atrium. Chandeliers glowed against high glass, string music softened the speeches. Diana attended out of obligation, a pale dress chosen to avoid notice. Yet, when the director toasted those unseen who make remembrance possible, her throat caught. Applause rose and sparkled like broken light. For a moment, she thought she glimpsed beyond the crowd two figures, one in a 193 suit, one in a long dress ink blue with age, standing near the staircase, watching. The angle shifted, and the image dissolved into reflections from crystal glass. She exhaled a small laugh at herself. Imagination, perhaps, or gratitude made visible. Later, she escaped upstairs to the dim archive corridor. Only her footsteps echoed now. She unlocked the annex display room and stood before the suitcase once more. The golden plaque caught candlelight from a wall sconce, the same tone that had glimmered the first night she found it. "You kept your promise," she whispered to the case. "Now I've kept mine." Her reflection in the glass merged with its surface, the two shapes blending until she almost couldn't tell which belonged to which. For a heartbeat, she wondered if another curator, decades from now, might sense her presence the way she had sensed Leduc's. Wordless guidance held in the grain of leather. The thought comforted her. In the weeks that followed, the story settled into legend. Children on school tours liked to retell it, how an old suitcase saved a museum. Guides humored them, adding their own embellishments about secret vaults and hidden gold. Diana never corrected them. Truth, she'd learned, didn't always need defending. Sometimes it only needed protecting. One crisp autumn evening, long after closing, she made her rounds through the silent galleries. The new lights in the restoration wing glowed warm against marble, reflecting faintly in the floor like scattered coins. She paused at the doorway, taking in the gentle hush, the sound of work completed and work continuing. Then she turned toward the exit corridor. The final security lights clicked into night mode, casting soft halos across displays. When she reached the suitcase, she lingered, fingertips against cool glass. Inside, the leather looked nearly black now, but a thin ribbon of reflected gold traced its handle, breathing as the ambient light pulsed. She smiled. Some mysteries stay awake just enough to remind their keepers they're alive. As she locked the case room and stepped back into the hall, the air carried the faintest scent of cedar and ink. Ghost notes of both donors, maybe, or just dust remembering touch. She didn't question it. Above, the clock struck 9. She moved through the gallery toward the main doors, every display bathed in a restive amber glow. At the entrance, she paused, turned to look once more at the staircase curving into dark, and saw the reflection of the entire museum behind her. Alive, restored, breathing history. Her key clicked against the lock. the door sealed with a quiet sigh. Outside, city lights shimmered on wet pavement like scattered bullion, but she didn't think of gold anymore. She thought of the unseen chain of hands that had carried its promise forward, each one choosing protection over possession. For a second, she felt someone's presence beside her, a whisper of approval, gone before she could name it. She let the smile stay. True value, she thought, isn't discovered, it's remembered. And as the night folded around the museum, that forgotten suitcase waited in its glass cell, a vessel of silence and light, keeping one small corner of history awake for whoever would listen next. The museum was silent except for the soft hum of its climate units. Diana made her last rounds with keys jangling faintly at her side, the click of each door sounding like punctuation on a chapter no one would ever read. The exhibits rested beneath low light, glass glowing faint gold across marble. She paused before the annex window where the suitcase sat under its display case. Still content, its cracked handle catching the reflection of exit lamps. She watched it quietly. The responsibility that had once felt like a secret now felt like kinship. The museum breathed on its own again, students returning, restorers humming as they worked late, every hallway filled with faint echoes of creation instead of decay. None of them needed to know what had seeded their good fortune. That was how legacy was supposed to feel. Anonymous, enduring, unclaimed. She turned the last key, the lock sliding shut with the gentle authority of completion. For a moment, a trace of light trembled across the handle, as if acknowledging her. A trick of reflection, maybe, or something kinder. A nod from those who had started the chain. The air carried a faint warmth, smelling of cedar and old paper, the scent she now associated with gratitude. As she reached the main door, she looked back through the glass toward the dim corridors. Behind her, every relic seemed to glow faintly, like embers under ash. She smiled, spoke softly into the still. History doesn't always reveal its reasons, only its keepers. Outside, city lights blurred into gold on damp pavement. She walked into the quiet street, the hum of traffic fading behind her, knowing the past was safe where it belonged. Kept by those who listened rather than owned. If stories like this make you wonder what else might be hiding in plain sight, subscribe for more strange discoveries.